So thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club that takes place on the first Tuesday of every month. Our sessions cover an array of engineering and leadership books that our awesome Lead Dev audience can draw insights and practical experiences from. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'm your moderator for this conversation. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and an executive coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Suzan Bond. Today, we'll be talking about just work. I always don't know how to say that title, but we'll get to that. It's an interesting sort of title. If you have questions for Kim, please pop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I will get to as many as I can. So Kim Scott is the author of Just Work: How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Build a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity, as well as Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. She co-founded 2 companies that help organizations put the ideas in her book into practice. Kim was a CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and other tech companies. Kim previously held leadership roles at Apple and Google. Earlier in her career, Kim managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. So interesting. I could just talk about your background for hours. But so welcome. You wrote a New York Times bestselling book, Radical Candor. I'm sure lots of folks who are here are familiar with that book. Such a huge achievement. You could have just stopped there. So what made you write Just Work?
Well, if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of feedback. And indeed, some feedback that I got about Radical Candor that prompted me to write Just Work. I was giving a talk at a tech company in San Francisco, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person I like and respect enormously, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech, or frankly, in any other sector. And when I finished giving the presentation, she pulled me aside and she said, "I'm excited, Kim, to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want, the kind of culture that's going to help us be successful. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you." And she went on to explain that as soon as she would offer anyone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, I had sort of 4 revelations at the same time. The first one was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague, the kind of person I imagined myself to be. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant at every meeting we had ever been in together, even though I knew in that period of time she had what to be ticked off about, as we all do. So the first thing that I realized was that I had not been an upstander. I had been sort of a silent bystander. And frankly, ignorance was no excuse. It was my duty to notice. The second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her, I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me as a woman in the workplace, as a white woman in the workplace. And I think part of the reason for that was that I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. But even less than wanting to think of my victim, did I ever want to think of myself as a perpetrator? And so I was most deeply in denial about the different ways in which I had actually harmed people who I worked with. I didn't intend to, obviously, but again, the point is to be the people we want to be, and for that we have to be aware of the harm that we're doing. And last but not least, I had failed as a leader to create the kinds of environments in which everyone could just work, just in the justice sense of the word, but also in the just get stuff done sense of the word. I think that's what you were saying, when I don't know quite how to read the title.
Right. I said it differently after I read it. I said when I first got it, and then after I read it, I thought, yes. Oh, this is really 2 meanings there, which is really quite
Maybe
lovely.
Too clever by half, perhaps.
Nah, I love that stuff. I live with someone who says puns a lot and, plays with words. So I thought it was fantastic. I mean, when I read it, as we were talking before, I found it an emotional book to read, especially for a business book. I mean, and I think in some ways because it's personal, I mean, the topic, obviously, but also you share stories about the way in which you look back and say, oh, did I make the right choices? Could I have responded differently? Why was it important for you to take this approach?
So a bunch of different reasons. I think the most important is that when we're talking about difficult, painful subjects, I think it's really important not to shy away from the pain. And it was important for me to write, in writing the book, to sort of confront a bunch of things that I had done and that had happened to me. And it was important for me to be able to think clearly and to come up with a framework. But I didn't want to then delete those stories and just share the framework, because a framework is so abstract and it's so prone to misinterpretation. Whereas if you illuminate a framework with personal stories, then literally our brains get on the same wavelength. And they do these fMRI studies, where they put these machines on people's heads. And when we tell each other stories, that's how we understand things. We build a shared understanding of the facts. So I think I was talking to Angela Duckworth, who wrote Grit, about this. And she studies behavior change. Like, what are the things that help us change behavior? And she said, having a simple framework that you can keep top of mind is important, but it's also important to tell stories so that you have emotional resonance. And then it's important to give people things they can do to put the ideas into practice. So that's, I guess, why I tried to write. Also, I wrote it that way because I like to read fiction. I like to read novels, and stories are what sort of motivate me and interest me. So that's also why I wrote it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you, I love it because whenever I read a nonfiction book, I actually look for the stories. I'm a person who tries to find, if I read an article or anything, I'm looking for that story where I can say, okay, the author's talking about this, but here's how it comes to life. Here's what it looks like. And something clicks in my brain, like you were saying, what they've done with the brain. How was it that were those stories top of mind, or did they kind of come out as you were writing the book?
Very much the latter. In fact, when I started, as I said, I was kind of in denial. And I kind of knew going into this book that I had been in denial, but I didn't really know quite how deep my denial was, because when I started the book, I thought, well, nothing that terrible has ever happened to me. I'm going to have to do research and talk to other people and pull in other people's stories. And as I started writing, I realized, oh my gosh, I have a story for every minute. I had a lot more. And in fact, there's a lot of stories that I did cut from the book and I think everyone has those stories of if everybody listening can sort of think about what's that moment when someone said something that left you kind of gobsmacked, you're like, did that just happen? This happens all the time and once I became more aware of it, it was much easier. It was like I was carrying an invisible load, a load I wasn't even aware I was carrying. And once I started writing these stories down, I was able to put down that load. So it was sort of liberating in a way.
It's so interesting because I felt that way when I read the book. I think we talked about, I felt it emotional, and I had to pause a little bit, especially after the first section. And then, but afterwards, I too felt liberated, more informed, and like, wow, okay, and I don't have that experience reading a business book very often. You know what I mean? Like, I would consider a business book, right? Business books sometimes are less. They don't have that emotional resonance, and I feel like the ones that do are really incredible. Okay, so I have some questions about the book itself. Like, we can talk about the process, which is great, but in that first section of the book, you outline 4 distinct roles. I kind of want to talk about them so that everybody has the same language. So we have, person harmed. I think we're all pretty clear about that one. Person doing harm, leaders, but you also have upstander. So can you talk about upstander and why you picked that word?
Yeah, so I struggled with that word. We use a lot of different words for this. So the one is bystander, but bystander sort of implies silent bystander, I think, for a lot of people.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to use a word that would imply that you stood up to, you noticed something wrong and you stood up to it. You weren't the silent bystander. I think other words that get used are often ally, but I think there's a lot of people who feel that ally is maybe too weak of a word, that that the ally, kind of like the silent bystander, is not invested in improving the process the way they ought to be. Other people love the word. I don't have strong feelings, but I felt like bystander was too weak and upstander was a little bit stronger. When I told the story about going to the tech company in San Francisco, that was my first realization, was that I imagine myself to be an upstander. And when I realized that I hadn't been that person, it was a big sort of realization for me. And I think a lot of people imagine that if they notice something wrong happening, they would say something. They would do something about it. And yet I think so often we have this default to silence. And so I wanted to, I don't want to put anyone in harm's way, but I want to kind of end that default to silence with this book.
Like some thoughts on why we can default to silence, rather, even though we want to speak up, we see injustice, we want to do right. What are your thoughts on, like, maybe why do we act maybe as bystanders sometimes when we really want to be upstanders?
I think the first part of the problem is that you can't fix problems you refuse to notice. And so I think we're reluctant to notice these things when they happen, because it's uncomfortable. And look, perhaps I contributed to this problem. Like, for example, in Radical Candor, I talk about praise in public, criticize in private. But if we notice bias happening, for example, I think we actually need to point it out publicly, because it's reflecting a pattern. If we're silent about that pattern, then we are reinforcing the pattern. We're reflecting and reinforcing it. And so I think there's this notion that it is, it's not nice. It's not, quote unquote, nice to point it out, but actually remaining silent about it is what's not nice. And it's not nice to the person who said the biased thing, because if they were not unaware of it, they'd rather be aware of it so they don't keep doing it. It's not nice to the person who experienced the biased thing, because it leaves them feeling like, did nobody else notice that weird thing? You're saying if it happens to you, you have to do the work of fixing it. Whereas if everyone who notices problems speak up, then we don't put too much of the burden on the person harmed. So I think that's part of it. I think sometimes we feel like, I don't want to make a big deal of it, but pointing it out is not making a big deal of it, and letting it sit silently. These things sort of accumulate and then they explode. So that is where the big deal comes from, in ignoring problems. It's not in speaking up about them.
Yeah, I think I agree on all of those. I also think sometimes I've heard people say, I didn't know what to say.
Yes.
I lost all my words, and I'm fumbling, and I'm kind of hot, and my stomach drops,
Yes.
and I know it's wrong, but I don't know what to say. I think that has happened for a few people, I think, as well.
Yes, I think probably for everyone. So one of the things that Trier Bryant, who co-founded the company Just Work with me, and I do, is we work on helping people know what to say when you don't know what to say. And I think one of the things that is helpful there is to begin to disambiguate bias, prejudice, and bullying. Because I think very often we conflate those three very different problems as though they're all the same thing, and they're not the same thing. You ready for some definitions?
Yeah, I'm so glad because like one of the things about your work, it's so powerful because you're so specific. I think that's one of the most powerful things, besides the fact that you made me feel. Can you give us some definitions of each and kind of how they look like so that we can all get on the same page?
Yes. Yeah. So I'll give you some definitions and tell you some stories. How about that? So bias is simply not meaning it. It's kind of a brain hiccup. And whereas prejudice is meaning it, it's a very consciously held belief. If bias is usually unconscious, prejudice is very conscious. And bullying, there's no belief there, conscious or unconscious. It's just being mean. So bias, not meaning it, prejudice, meaning it, bullying, being mean. And so the thing that is, so let's sort of talk about how this looks, because those definitions they're useful in that they're very brief and easy to remember, but there's a lot more to bias, prejudice, and bullying than those quick definitions. So an example of bias, a friend of mine, Aileen Lee, who started a venture capital firm called Cowboy VC, was walking into a meeting with two colleagues who were men. And the other side sort of filed in, and they started sitting across from the two men and then filed on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. And that's often how bias shows up. It's just who we choose to sit near. And Aileen started talking because she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. And when the other side had questions, they directed questions at the men in the room, not at Aileen. Ever seen that happen? It's yes. And so it happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time. And finally, one of Aileen's colleagues stood up and he said, "I think Aileen and I should switch seats." That was an upstander right there. And that was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. And if he hadn't said that, then the other side never would have started listening to Aileen and they wouldn't have won the deal. So why did he do it? Two reasons. One, he cared about Aileen and he didn't like seeing her get ignored. But two, he just wanted to win the deal. And he knew that if he couldn't get them to listen to her, they wouldn't win the deal. And he also knew, I guess there's kind of a third element there. He also knew it was more efficient for him to do it than for her to do it herself, because it was easier for those guys to hear it from him than it would have been if she had stood up and said, "I think we should switch seats." So, which she was perfectly capable of doing. So that's an example of an I statement. If you think it's bias, respond with an I statement. An I statement, sort of, whether it's happening to you or whether you're noticing it happening in the room, an I statement invites the other person in to understand things from your perspective. It's sort of like holding up a mirror, and the other person notices what's wrong and they sort of automatically fix it. Now, if it's prejudice, holding up a mirror is not going to work, is it? Because the person's going to grin in the mirror. Yeah, they like what they see. And so it's a little trickier to deal with prejudice. So, for example, Trier, who co-founded Just Work with me, tells a story about being in a hiring meeting, and they had interviewed about 10 candidates, and by far the most qualified, everyone agreed that by far the most qualified person was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally in the interview. And the hiring manager said, "Oh, well, we can't extend an offer to that candidate." And when the team said, "Why not?" the hiring manager said, "Well, we can't put that hair in front of the business." Believe me, nowhere in the hiring rec was hair mentioned. So now you need an it statement. An it statement, it sort of draws a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they cannot impose that belief on others, that consciously held belief. And so an it statement could appeal to the law, it could appeal to an HR policy, or it could appeal to common sense. It is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was in that state because of the Crown Act. It is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was at that company. Or it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. And so that is a much stronger response. And prejudice demands a more strong response than bias does. But what about when it is bullying? When you think you're confronting bullying, what you really want to do is use a you statement. If an I statement invites someone in to understand things from your perspective, a you statement pushes them away and make sure that you're in sort of an assertive role in the conversation. And I learned this technique from my daughter, actually, when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground, and I was encouraging her to use an I statement, as adults often do to kids in that situation. And you know, I feel sad. Tell this kid, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? Really good point.
So wise.
Yes, from the mouth of babes. And I realized that's when you're confronting bullying, you really need a you statement. You can't talk to me like that, or what's going on for you here? Or if that feels like it might escalate too much, even just change the subject. Where'd you get that shirt? But now they're answering your questions, and you're kind of pushing that behavior away from yourself. So that's a kind of a very simple way to think about bias, prejudice, and bullying, and how to respond in the moment. But of course, there's a lot of things that leaders can do to make it more likely that people will feel liberated to use their I statement, it statement, or you statement.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk some more about that. That's such a great example. And I've not heard that before, the I, the it, and the you, but it makes sense. When I've been bullied, and I was bullied growing up quite a bit, I remember trying the I, and that didn't work. Like, no, that did not work. Okay, that did not, nope, moving in the wrong direction, right? Yeah. Just increased. Yeah. But that whole you statement, I wouldn't say the kid's name. My brother was also bullied, and I would say blank. I wouldn't say his name. You can't talk to my brother that way. And he stopped bullying me. And I was younger, but he was a school bully, and he stopped talking to my brother that way. He stopped bullying my brother. And so it's interesting how as like kids, we maybe find those things, and then we have to remember them as adults.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also a good example of why the upstander is so important. It was probably, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm guessing it was easier for you to say, you can't talk to my brother that way, than it would have been for your brother. Just as if you were getting bullied, hopefully your brother would have said, you can't talk to my sister that way. Like, you can't talk to, you cannot talk to your colleagues that way.
Right. It is hard too, when you're person being bullied, sometimes you just start shrinking because every ounce of, it's like emotions, your emotional body takes over, the primitive emotions. And, and people have certainly spoken up for me too. But yeah, it's a good point about the upstanders role. I hadn't even remembered that story, by the way, about, about that until we just talked about that. Okay. See, I love
stories are good, right? We got on the same wavelength.
Yeah, for sure. But
I'm sorry about you getting bullied though. And it's awful. It's awful.
Yeah. It's hard, I mean, I think, and I think a lot of us have been bullied even at work, which we feel like that should go in the schoolyard, but it continues at work, and how damaging it can be for the people and for the culture, because also when we're seeing somebody be bullied, part of us is like, am I next?
Yeah.
Honestly, like, when we see someone, we're like, that's bad also, but am I next? And it instills a culture of fear, which is just terrible for companies in tech, which are like trying to innovate, do great work, do different things.
Yeah. Am I next? And also, I think the other thing that happens when you observe bullying and you don't, and I want everyone to cut themselves some slack. We all observe bullying and we haven't intervened. Like, let's be gentle and generous with ourselves and with others. But one of the things I've noticed that happens to me, and a lot of people have reported happens to them as well, is that when I notice bullying and I don't do anything, I feel like I now am a participant in the bullying. And then I feel bad, and I feel slimed by someone else's behavior. My son was telling me this. He said, I saw a kid get bullied, and I didn't know what to do. And now I feel like I participated in the bullying, and I feel, and it like woke him up in the middle of the night. Yeah, we've all had that experience. And so you get slimed by someone else's bad behavior when you don't intervene in some way. Even if it's just to go up to the person who got bullied and say something to them later, say, are you okay? That was gross. Like, because I think one of the things I have experienced when I've gotten bullied in public is if nobody comes up and notices what has happened, then I feel even more alone. That's the silence around the bullying is almost just as bad, if not worse, than the bullying itself.
Absolutely. Well, and on that note, there's something in when you talk about bullying that really caught my eye, which is bloviating BS as a form of bullying. I was like, I don't know what that is. And it gets tolerated too often. Can you talk a little bit about that specific behavior in the workplace and maybe what leaders and upstanders can do around to counteract it?
Yes. So one of the things that I have noticed throughout my career, and even as a student, is that people who are overrepresented can more easily get away with BSing their way through things, and it's much harder for people who are underrepresented to BS their way through things. And so you'll often there was one person who I talked to who was in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion at a big bank. And this person said that they would see it happen all the time, that there'd be a meeting and the people in the meeting who were underrepresented were overprepared. They actually knew more of the facts, and yet they didn't speak up. And the people who knew less were the ones who and then they got promoted for the bloviating BS. I noticed this happen when I was in high school. I did Model UN, and the first couple of years I did it, I was extremely well prepared. And the last year I did it, a bunch of bad things were happening, and I didn't prepare. And so when I got in there, I was just watching what was happening, and I realized that the people who were dominating didn't know anything about their countries either. They had not done their research. They were just like they were just bullying each other. They were just BSing and bloviating, and being really loud. And I was like, well, I can do that too. And so I started doing that. And then I felt kind of ashamed of myself, and I went home early. And I remember I was taking a bath, and my mom came charging into the bathroom, and she said, "Kim, you won the Best Delegate Award." And I thought, is that how the world works? A friend of mine who is very kind said that kind of postulatory boldness, which is a nicer way of saying bloviating BS. And the lesson that I learned from that is not that I should engage in bloviating BS, but that I should learn how to shut it down as a leader, because it does not help us get to the best answer. And in fact, it often hides the best answer. And it also means that the people who know the most speak the least often. And, there's enormous body of research that shows when everyone on a team participates roughly equally, the team performs better. In fact, you're better off having a team of people who are all working together than a team of people on which there's one, the mythical 10x engineer. It turns out collaboration is humanity's superpower. And if we let one person dominate, or a couple of people dominate, then we fail to harness our superpower as human beings.
I love that. I mean, I loved it because I thought, I bet there's a lot of us who wouldn't really have considered that a form of bullying. Maybe like, it's not great behavior, or that's just the way so-and-so is, but we wouldn't really look at that as maybe a form of bullying, and then leaders that might get by them, or upstanders that might get by.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the reason why I identified it as the reason why I left that Model UN early is because I felt gross. I felt like I had behaved bad. I had bullied. I had bullied. And but this is another reason why I sort of dug deep and tried to look in the mirror as I wrote this book, Just Work, is because it's easier to identify behaviors in ourselves than in others if we're really honest with each other. And so behavior that I might have given a pass to, when I indulged in it, I realized, oh, that was bad. That was bad behavior, and I shouldn't tolerate it in myself. But I also, as a leader, need to make sure that I'm not allowing others to sort of BS their way through. That, it's tempting. There was an article, I think it was in the Washington Post, that I gave a reference to it in the book, about BS and the fact that wealthy people tend to BS more than people who aren't wealthy. White people tend to BS more than people who are not white. Men tend to BS more than. So if you're sort of overrepresented along some dimension, it's safer for you to BS. And it also is beneficial to be. I mean, people do it because it works, right? And so
you won model delegate.
Yeah,
right.
Right. But the job of the leader is not to make it safe for everybody to make stuff up. The job of the leader is to make sure everyone has a voice, and that there's not that benefit to BSing.
Yeah. I love that. I want to cover a couple other things. So I want to talk about bias in a little bit more detail too. Like, what can leaders do when they notice bias showing up? What are some things that leaders might be able to do?
Yeah, so a leader can intervene, but I think the most important thing that a leader, and a leader should intervene personally, but the most important thing a leader can do is to teach everyone on the team to intervene, to create what Trier and I call a process of bias disruption, bias disruptors. And so there's three parts to bias disruptors. The first is sort of a shared vocabulary. What is the word or phrase that your team is likely to feel comfortable using that will help them speak up? You help them know what to say when they don't know what to say, when they notice bias. And the key thing here is that you ask your team. Don't impose language on your team. So ask them. So teams we've worked with have used yo. Other teams have said bias alert. Another team said, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. Another team threw up a peace sign. Trier and Nia and I tend to wave a purple flag on our team. And so the purple, it's a friendly purple flag. It's not a red flag. It's not a yellow flag. Yeah. It's getting thrown out of the game. We're inviting people in to notice. Yeah. And sometimes I'll wave a flag on myself. And
wave it.
Oops. Yeah. Oops. I said that thing. I didn't mean to say it. Sorry. And so that's number one. Now, the second thing that you need to teach, if you're a leader, you need to teach your team to do is how to respond when it's you who said the biased thing, when someone's waving the flag at you. Because I don't know about you, but when I suddenly realize, or when someone points it out to me that I've said or done something biased, I feel deeply ashamed. And when we feel ashamed, we go into lizard brain, actually, and we rarely are responding at our best when we're in shame brain. And giving people kind of an understanding that the way to respond is, first of all, to thank the person for pointing it out, and then either to say, I get it, I'll work on it, but please point it out if I make the same mistake again, because we will. It takes persistence to change. These are deeply ingrained patterns of thought. Or, thank you for pointing it out, but I don't quite get it. I don't know what I did wrong. Can we talk after the meeting? And the reason to talk after the meeting is because some of the promise of Just Work is that you're going to get stuff done. So you want to disrupt the bias, not the meeting, but you do want to disrupt the bias. And then which brings me to step number 3, which is a shared commitment. We need to promise ourselves that we're going to point out bias at least once in every meeting. Because believe me, someone in every meeting, everywhere, is going to say or do something biased. Not because we're horrible human beings, but because we are fallible human beings. And the only way to get better is to learn together about these things.
That's so good. I think that's like, again, you're so specific and useful. It always strikes me that your work is so useful and concrete. And I want to talk about, I want to go, before we go on to some other like questions about leaders, I want to talk a little bit about prejudice. And one of the things that you suggested is to create a code of conduct. What are some things that we might want to keep in mind around that code of conduct, particularly as it relates to prejudice?
Yeah. So I said an it statement, for example, and a code of conduct does the same thing. It draws a line in the sand. People are free to believe what it's not your job as a manager to control people's thoughts. The thought police is not, but it is your job to explain what kind of behaviors are okay and not okay. So a person can believe whatever they want. They can't impose their belief on others. And making it clear where that line is it sounds, I say it like, oh, it's so easy. It's really complicated. So one of the things I recommend that leaders do is think about a few situations that could happen and scenario plan them out. So if this happens, so for example, one scenario that I propose in the book is there was an employee at Google who wrote this memo about that basically it said a lot of things, but one of the things that it said was that the reason why women at Google were less happy on the Google Guys survey than men was not because they were experiencing bias, prejudice, or bullying at Google, but because they were more neurotic. And he believed this. He wrote it down. And so that was a problem. It killed productivity for days. But luckily, Google had a code of conduct that was clear enough that they said, look, this is the kind of thing that harms your colleagues and is a fireable offense. And obviously he got some warnings. He didn't just get fired for writing. There was a lot more to the story, but this is why it's so think about, like, is it okay in the US? This is a US centric, so I'll wave a purple flag on my US centric bias, but are you going to allow people to wear MAGA hats and to Make America Great Again hats into work or not? And there are reasons to do it. There are reasons to not do it. And, I would err on the side of saying that's not okay. But you want to think through, does your code of conduct sort of give people clear enough guides what's okay, what's not okay?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. So I have just two more questions left before we wrap up here. I want to take us to companies. So what are some things that companies can do organizationally to prevent discrimination? Like in hiring, performance management, org design, what are things that maybe a few, this probably still seems a little overwhelming to folks. So just maybe a couple of thoughts might help them, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things to realize is that the conditions for discrimination happen when you have bias or prejudice plus power. So if we go back to the story of the hiring manager who didn't want to extend an offer to someone because of their hair, that was prejudice. She had the power to put her prejudice into practice, or she thought she did. As it turned out, there was an HR policy that was the HR policy, the code of conduct was one thing, but more importantly, what you can do as a leader is to measure bias or prejudice at every stage of the employee life cycle. So what do I mean by that? Because sometimes the kind of discrimination that happens it's almost like unconscious discrimination. It's unconscious bias plus power yields this, and that's very hard to litigate, but you obviously don't want to do it if you want to create a inclusive work environment, and if you want to hire the best people, the right people for the right job. So for example, there was a team that I worked with, and they quantified their bias. So what we recommend is quantify your bias. Now, that does not have to be a very complicated quantification process. They noticed that on the executives, on the CEO's team, there were no women. Like, it didn't take a math was zero, you know. And sometimes it's more complicated. If you've got a bigger company, you do want to cut the numbers. But in this case, it was pretty simple. And so they invited me. To their credit, they knew the problem was probably their promotion process, not the women at the company. And so they invited me to sit in on the hiring meeting. And they talked about, there were two people up for promotion, and the man and one man, one woman, and they were both great leaders, but they referred to the man as a great leader, and they referred to the woman as a real mother hen. I was like, all right, guys, back the train up. And they're like, oh, it's no big deal. I mean, you know, we didn't mean anything. I'm like, of course you didn't mean anything, but who are you going to promote, the real leader or the real mother hen? Like, give me a break. And to their credit, you know, so you want to make sure that at the hiring process, you take a look at who you are bringing in the door to interview, and do an experiment. Take a week or a month and strip all the personally identifiable information out of resumes before you decide who you're bringing in, and notice, does the balance, and if the balance shifts, if there's a difference in the makeup of the candidates who you're bringing in, then you've uncovered some unconscious bias in your process, and that should be celebrated because now you can fix it. And so there's a bunch of stuff you can do to fix it. We can talk about that. It's in the book. We'll put it that way because I know we're running short of time. So you want to also measure pay. You want to take a look at, you want to cut it by however you're defining diversity. You cut it by gender, cut it by race, cut it by sexual orientation. And you want to make sure that you're not systematically underpaying people. Because very often what happens is when we make people offers, we're reflecting and reinforcing a pay gap that's in the market. And so you don't want to do that. You want to make sure you're taking a look at ratings, and again, cut it. You want to take a look at promotions and cut it by gender, by race, however you're measuring diversity on your team, and make sure you're not sort of systematically allowing unconscious bias to skew your decision making.
Those are so
measure what matters, and yet it's rare.
It's so useful and helpful. I mean, I guess I just want to end our conversation on, I think a topic like this can maybe feel overwhelming for us. Like, where do we start? As an upstander, as a leader, you know, as a human in an organization, because I think the thing is, I think most of us want to work in more just organizations. I think most of us really do.
100%.
Like, what are small, like, what would you advise if I'm feeling overwhelmed about where do I start to shift the culture or to begin to tackle some of these things? Because what you said, right, there's bias at pretty much every meeting. I think it was bias you said.
Yes.
So what are maybe some small things you might advise, or how people can begin to think about this?
I think the simplest place to start is to begin when you have that moment, like, ugh, that just happened. What do I try to think? Am I guessing this is bias, prejudice, or bullying? And somehow just like that analytical framework for me, at least, so then I like my shoulders relax a little bit because now I'm thinking about this. And you don't relax. You don't have to say for sure what it is. But if you think it's bias, say the word I and notice then what comes out of your mouth next. If you think it's prejudice, say the word it and notice what comes out of your mouth next. If you think it's bullying, say the word you, and then notice what comes out of it. Sometimes there's just a little bit of activation energy can go a long way. So start there, try that, and send me a note, kim@justworktogether.com. I want to know how it's working for folks. What's helpful, what's not helpful, what could we at Just Work Together do to help you all put these ideas into practice.
I love that. And maybe it'll lead to a third book. Okay. Obviously, I loved your book. Thank you so much for joining us during this session. It was really a great conversation. Our next session will be June 7th, where we'll be speaking with Sarah Drasner on her book, Engineering Management for the Rest of Us. And on July 5th, we'll be talking with Ryan Singer on his book, Shape Up, Stop Running in Circles and Ship Work That Matters. Thanks again for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.